So it's not simply a case of damage avoidance, but it's a case of developing your business. And it's sometimes, I think, forgotten when companies develop these systems. So that's the internal side. Let's have a brief look at the external side. Again, the principles, I think, should be sort of fairly familiar to everybody, and I don't think they're terribly controversial. If you're going to have an external system, you want one which is accessible for people, and you want one which supports the consumer, you want it to be fair, you want it to be effective, you want it to give appropriate redress, needs to be independent of the industry, and it needs to be accountable for its actions. And I'm not actually going to stand up here and pretend that the UK system is a marvellous model that should be adopted, because it pretty clearly isn't. Although UK telecoms companies are obliged to sign up to an external complaint handler, the legislation was drafted on the basis of the frankly rather dumb idea that it would be a good idea to have competition in complaints handling systems. So we've got two. We have the Office of the Telecommunications Ombudsman, or TELO, which is the best known of the two, and we have the Communication and Internet Services Arbitration Scheme, or CISAS. And the industry is split between the two. I think Otello has somewhat more companies, both in terms of size and number, than CISAS does. But one of the consequences of this, of course, is that people go to the wrong scheme. And if you look at both the reports of both the schemes, there's a steady and significant group of consumers who've ended up at the wrong place and have to be referred to the other one. Whether they get there, don't know. There is also a problem in relation to the UK schemes about awareness, because the level of awareness of both Otello and CISAS is very, very low. It's, I think, no more than 10% of the consumers surveyed had any spontaneous awareness of these bodies. You know, so there's a problem there. In terms of consumer support and fairness, these schemes do reasonably well. They're helpful, they're clearly objective, and like the TIO, they can provide appropriate redress. They can actually provide compensation to consumers, albeit on sort of modest level. In terms of effectiveness, there are some issues here. In particular, in the UK, there isn't an equivalent to the mechanism that TIO has for systemic complaints for either Otello or CISAS, although they do make comments on what they regard as important general issues, but there's no mechanism for feeding them into the regulator. It's really the financial services area that's developed this much better, where there's a much more formal relationship between the Financial Ombudsman Service and the regulator there. Currently the Financial Services Authority, but this will change, whereby complaints which raise important matters of principle can be taken up by the regulator. What struck me looking at the TIO's reports, and I'd be interested to hear about this, is actually that there are quite a lot of investigations of systemic issues. in TIO, reported by the TIO, and rather more than I thought there would be. And it's not clear that having investigated and identified a systemic issue, seems to be necessarily being cleared up. So, I mean, that's really a question that I've got. In terms of independence, I think all the schemes are clearly demonstrably independent of the industry. In terms of accountability, again, I think the UK schemes aren't quite as good as the TIO because we don't have in the UK the level of publicity about complaints relating to individual companies. We don't get disaggregated data about how companies are doing. It's clear that some companies are better at complaint handling than others, but we don't know who they are. And although the data here in Australia is, I think, relatively simple, at least it's a sort of first step on the way to seeing who's better and who's worse at complaint handling. So that's a sort of principles. A few brief conclusions then. I think the evidence suggests that complaint handling by telecoms companies, both here and in the UK, has been pretty ineffective. The headline numbers in this country really, to me, tell their own story. The only area I've seen in anything like this number in the UK is in financial services. And that's a much bigger industry with a bigger population and one where there's been lots of problems over recent years. And I think it's probably fair to say this is, for me, a failure of the industry here to meet the expectations of consumers. And the systems that's been set up, again, both here and in the UK, are largely self-regulatory systems, although there's an element of oversight and approval by regulators in both setups. And it seems to me, looking at the Australian system, that there's probably a need to rethink the regulatory arrangements, because in some ways I find this quite paradoxical. I find the evidence in relation to Australia quite paradoxical, because if I look at the code of practice of the Communications Alliance, actually what the code says seems to me pretty reasonable. It seems to me a pretty good arrangement of rules and things. And then you look at what seems to be happening, and you do wonder whether the telecoms companies are actually doing what the code says they ought to do. And that suggests to me that there need to be better incentives for the companies to comply with the code. I wonder, for example, whether actually the TIO is charging enough money per case. You know, I mean, I want, because that's, you know, an incentive not to let a case get to the TIO. Most of the cases, as I understand it, the TIO deals with are ones that are relatively simple, that are sent back to the company for resolution. They're what called Category 1 cases. And you wonder whether there's enough incentive on the companies to sort them out and stop them going to the TIO.